let's insult two religions at once. The church of I'm spiritual, not religious, and the church of only what's peer-reviewed is real. Both sneer at ritual. One calls it superstition, the other calls it costume. Meanwhile, the vertebrate nervous system just keeps doing vertebrate things, orienting to scent before thought, mirroring bodies before belief, syncing breath and pulse to the loudest, steadiest signal in the room, storing context as smell-tagged memory, and relaxing when it recognizes a predictable sequence of events that ends without violence. Ritual didn't ask your opinion. It wired itself into you before you learned a single slogan. Here's the obscenity polite people avoid. Incense, bowing, and chanting are standardized inputs. They are not metaphors, they're levers. Incense exploits the olfactory shortcut to limbic centers that gate mood, salience, and recall. No cortical permission needed. Bowing exploits posture's bidirectional channel with effect and dominance maps, spine, head angle, eye line, quietly throttling the part of you that believes it must perform to survive. Chanting exploits respiratory vocal coupling, rhythm, and social entrainment. The ancient mammalian trick where a room becomes a single organism for long enough that shame loosens and truth can fit through a mouth. You want this to be just culture because culture feels optional. It isn't. Ritual is interface between private physiology and public promise. It turns scattered mammals into a room that can do something other than argue. It is also dangerous because anything that can synchronize can deceive, and anything that can soften defenses can smuggle power. That's why mature lineages wrap ritual in governance, scripts, cues, roles, audits, prohibitions. When ritual is healthy, it lowers harm and accelerates repair. When ritual is captured, it anesthetizes conscience and converts devotion into budget. Minimalist spirituality fetishizes the end state, calm, clean lines, while disdaining the machinery that produces reliability under load. Ritual is that machinery. It gives the body a ladder out of panic that intellect can't build fast enough. You can sit there explaining yourself until the hour dies, or you can let smoke, shape, and sound yank you into rhythm with other animals who also stop pretending they were brains on sticks. If the phrase nervous system tech makes you queasy because it scrapes the romance off your incense, good. Romance is what marketers add when they don't know how something works. Rituals work. That's why empires tried to outlaw them, why cults overuse them, and why the most honest rooms don't apologize for them. They aim them. Ritual is not there to flatter your taste. It's there to rewire your reflexes so your ethics don't collapse just because the day did. Smell is rude. It ignores the front desk of cognition and walks straight into the back office where mood, threat, and recollection haggle without you. The olfactory bulb routes to amygdala, hippocampus, orbitofrontal cortex, the rooms that tag experience with good, bad, mine, never again. That's why a whiff can drag you years backward in a blink, why you can taste a breakup in a hallway, why grief has a chemical grammar. The old people who lit resins and woods weren't being mystical. They were indexing, pairing a sequence of sounds, gestures, and silences with a spectrum of volatile compounds so the whole thing could be retrieved later under stress with one breath. Incense is context compression. A community can fit thousands of hours of coordination into a signature aroma, then use that aroma to call the state back when speech would be clumsy or too slow. Put bluntly, smoke is a checksum. If the room smells right, the body predicts, we know this choreography. Nobody is about to die. Anxiety loses the advantage it gains from novelty. Even the ash is a clock. Sticks and coils were timekeeping devices long before phones. The point wasn't romance. It was predictability. And predictability is anesthesia for panic. But scent isn't innocent. It's politics in the air. Who chooses it? Who pays for it? Whose lungs pay the price when rooms ignore asthma and migraine? When colonizers turned frankincense, sandalwood, and agar wood into luxury pipelines, they weren't importing mysticism. They were extracting trees and labor, then selling the feeling back to people who forgot smell has an ecology. A community that calls itself awake should be able to say the words supply chain without blushing. Ritual that can't survive an audit will not survive history. There's also the austerity trap, the modern purity cult that rejects scent as theatrical, then wonders why memory won't bind and rooms won't settle. The brain doesn't care about your aesthetics. It cares about statistical learning, what recurs, what predicts, what soothes. Scent recurring in careful dosage lowers ambiguity and raises availability. When you're frightened, that matters more than your taste. No, incense doesn't make you wise. It gives wisdom an entrance. It lowers the noise floor so a human voice can land without having to compete with your cortisol. It ties today to yesterday so your nervous system feels like it has a past worth trusting. If you want rituals that work, stop pretending smoke is poetry. It's a protocol, one that deserves stewardship, not apology. Bodies negotiate rank before sentences start. Chin, gaze, chest, distance, a pre-verbal parliament. Bowing vandalizes that parliament on purpose. It drags the head below the story, punctures the fantasy of centrality the way pulling a plug punctures a bath, and tells the mammal stand down with angles, not arguments. That is not self-hatred. It's risk management. Whenever meaning and power collect, the ape brain wants to posture. Bowing is the governor that keeps horsepower from turning into homicide. Ritually, institutionally, domestically, the genius is in the specificity of form. A bow is not generic submission. It's a shaped gesture that evacuates display cues while preserving dignity. Hands, spine, eyes, timing. Each parameter closes a loophole the ego would exploit. Too shallow, and it's theater. Too deep, and it becomes self-erasure that predators love. The right bow held just long enough to shave the edge off entitlement, then released. Lets intelligence speak without the usual jamming signal of me. Done across a room, it turns a crowd of biographies into one organism with fewer collisions. Of course, abusers adopted it. Any tool that lowers guard can be inverted to steal sovereignty. That's why healthy lineages glue bowing to counterpower, grievance channels that bite, rotation of roles, audits that surface the invisible, peers who can say, stop. Without that web, bowing is camouflage for extortion. With it, bowing is an equalizer. Old and young, rich and broke, brilliant and ordinary. Each signs the same contract with posture before trying to move the world with words. There's also the quiet physics. Flexion modulates breath, voice, heart. Hand position gives the animal something to do that isn't fidgeting. Eye angle downgrades the hunger to scan for threat or status. You don't believe your way into humility. You aim a collection of levers until the organism calms down enough to consider not being the center of everything. Then language has a chance to be clean. People who mock bowing as medieval are welcome to keep negotiating reality with sarcasm and clenched jaws. Adults don't waste a reliable tool because it embarrasses their pride. Bowing is civilizational ergonomics, a shape that makes rooms safer for speech, not because it flatters power, but because it tells every mouth, just for a breath, you are not the judge. That pause is where truth squeezes through. Chanting offends modern taste because it refuses the cult of the singular voice. It fuses throats into one instrument and dares the ego to complain while its vagus melts. Under the hood, it's ancient math, respiration, pacing yoked to phonation, syllable-bound timing cues that eradicate the micro-decisions which burn your glucose, steady amplitude narrowing the jitter that keeps fear alive, and entrainment, the mammal trick where heart intervals, breath waves, and micro movements drift into phase alignment. Put that in a stone room and vowels start carving air together. The room answers. Your organism says, this is larger than me, and we survived it last time. Threat drops, availability rises. People romanticize the text. The text matters. Ethics, philosophy, memory, but the carrier matters first. Phonemes that aren't simply read, they're worn. Monosyllabic hits act like metronomes for attention. Long vowels wash the animal with predictable airflow. Drone pitches let those who can't sing still belong. Call and response installs turn-taking in bodies that haven't spoken all day. What you get is a behavioral exoskeleton. Nobody has to be inspired to be decent for 12 minutes. The song constrains the chaos. Weapon makers learned this, of course. Stadiums, rallies, and cults abuse the same mechanics. Entrain, inflate, point. If content is poison, the body doesn't know until it's too late. That's why chant belongs with doctrine and governance. Words should be able to stand examination when the drum stops. Leaders should be interruptible by peers when pitch becomes command. Rooms that won't publish budgets shouldn't pound your diaphragm with bass. Chanting's other unglamorous gift is timekeeping. It can lengthen silence without the panic silence sometimes triggers, and it can suture segments of a ritual with audible joins, so the nervous system trusts the transitions. Now we gather, now we confess, now we promise, now we shut up. When people survive the same arc often enough, their bodies learn the reliability of ends. That memory inoculates against despair in bad weeks. You can sneer at all this as anthropology, but the task of becoming a person who harms less is not achieved by thoughts alone. A well-aimed chant doesn't make you holy. It makes you reachable to instruction, to remorse, to joy that doesn't need a villain. If your spirituality can't sing, it's a memo. Memos don't change mammals. Music does. A bell is not a mood. It's a knife that carves the next second away from the last so the mind can stop smearing everything with yesterday. Struck clean, a bell weaponizes physics, attack, bloom, overtones against rumination. The initial transient steals attention. The harmonic tail gives it somewhere safe to land. That is a gift to a brain addicted to completing loops it can't complete. The sound completes for you again and again until your cortex remembers how to stop biting itself. Drums and wooden clappers do the opposite. They convene. Low frequencies recruit the body from the inside. Percussive onsets stamp a timeline where bodies can meet. A big room can't coordinate without acoustic rulers that ignore distance. Paper schedules don't reach the lizard. Sound does. The old-timers weren't quaint. They were engineers of latency. Why specific instruments? Because timbre encodes identity. And Mokugyo's thunk says, we chant now, not we flee. A Jesus flash says, attention, not argument. The nervous system learns these associations the way it learns a loved one's footsteps, non-verbally, with zero patience for your philosophy. It's Pavlov without the cruelty. The cue predicts a sequence that ends clean, and the organism relaxes into it because prophecy keeps arriving on time. This isn't universally gentle. Startle responses, trauma history, neurodiversity. Humans are plural, and sound is blunt. Rooms that pretend otherwise are advertising, not refuge. The answer is not to sterilize the soundscape until it's beige. It's to own your choices. Why this bell and not that? Why this cadence, length, and loudness? Who is excluded by this decibel map? Rituals that work don't worship objects. They tune them to the people who must live there. Silence gets cut here too. The space after the strike isn't emptiness. It's permission. The bell ended the last demand. The pause refuses to rush the next. That micro-Sabbath is how shame leaks out of a room without a speech. When a community has survived many such cuts, their calendar grows a spine. Meetings finish closer to on time. Eulogies don't become novels. The poor are less bored. That's not poetry. That's acoustic governance. If your resistance is that all this is theatrical, congratulations. You've discovered that theater is the mammal interface for time. You can loathe that and keep failing, or you can ring something true and stop pretending chaos is honest. The photograph shows a serene hall. The invoice shows detergent, repairs, fuel, visas, rent, rice, books, mics, brooms, and the bill for the electrician who stopped the bell tower from becoming an insurance claim. If that list offends your notion of purity, your notion is a child. Reliability is expensive. Not only money, but attention, maintenance, and governance. Rituals that work sit on top of logistics that don't collapse when the most charismatic person gets the flu. Incense has provenance. Bowls break, robes fray, bells crack, songs go out of tune. People get loud, sick, pregnant, fired, widowed, homeless. If your ritual concept can't metabolize that chaos into predictable compassion, the kind that arrives with receipts, not sentiment, you don't have a sanctuary, you have a stage. The old forms survived because they distribute load, roles, rotations, contingency plans, call trees, budgets that make generosity not depend on a harried saint. There's a brutal ethical ledger under all this. Scent excludes asthmatics if you don't plan. Sound excludes the overwhelmed if you don't modulate. Bowing injures those with the wrong hips if you don't understand bodies. Chanting in one language erases another if you don't translate or rotate. Decor lifted from cultures you won't study is theft dressed as taste. The fix isn't endless apology, it's ops, choices documented, trade-offs named, doors kept open for those who are never the default. Logistics are also how you prevent ritual capture by narcissists, publish budgets, rotate power, put grievance channels where everyone can find them, attach bells to calendars, not to whims, put scripts on paper and let the paper survive the personalities. The moment a leader can move the room by changing the sensorium on a whim, you've put the thermostat of human trust in one person's pocket. That is the opposite of sanctuary. Yes, this is unromantic. The romance you're craving is a souvenir of other people's competence. If you want the scent to calm and the chant to bind and the bow to level, someone had to count the spoons. Respect them. Better become them. There is nothing less spiritual than making sure the bowl is there when the hungry arrive. If you strip the hashtags off ritual and walk it into a lab, two families of effects keep showing up where the theatre thins: synchrony and costly signaling. When bodies move, breathe, or sound together, they cooperate more and punish freeloading less, up to a point. The room becomes easier to govern because prediction errors drop. Everyone can tell what's next. That makes kindness cheaper to deploy. But synchrony is amoral. Marches and mobs use it too. Content and governance decide whether the shared pulse saves the vulnerable or tramples them. Costly signaling is the other backbone. Visible investment that can't be faked cheaply, time on the floor, voices spent, attention held through boredom, money re-aimed, postures that bruise pride. Not for masochism, the cost is the receipt. It tells onlookers, this matters enough to hurt a little, and it tells the self, I remember this because I paid. Empty rituals erase cost and become content. Honest rituals count cost and direct it toward protection. Memory is the third shadow benefit. Cue rich contexts, scent, sound, shape, encode sequences more densely than ideas alone ever will. That encoding lets people retrieve a behavioral script under stress when cognition goes cheap. In decent communities, the script is simple: gather, tell the truth, repair, redistribute, rest. No incense can install that in a liar, but incense can help a truth teller find the door when the hallway is loud. None of this needs a sermon. It needs refusal to lie about what is happening. A room with incense and chant and bows is not performing metaphysics to impress the sky. It is performing coordination to impress upon animals that they are safer together than they are apart. Measure what matters. Strangers feel less strange after the arc. Vulnerable people report fewer collisions. Speech becomes shorter, truer, kinder. Budgets align better with mouths. If the numbers move, keep the form. If they don't, the form is cosplay and should be retired without drama. Rituals that work survive being weighed because they were never afraid of scales. They were built by people who valued outcomes over aura and were rude enough to say, if the room isn't changing, the room is lying. Rituals are not relics. They are the civil engineering of the nervous system, public works for the interior life. They make rooms where ethics are cheaper than panic and where the body can stop pretending it is alone and heroic. You don't have to like them. But if you're serious about harm going down and repair getting faster, you will stop insulting the only tools that have ever made frightened animals keep their promises. Keep the smoke, but stop lying about its origins and effects. It's a cue, a clock, a memory tag, and a trade route. Steward it or skip it. Keep the bow, but fasten it to governance so it can't be weaponized by the insecure. Keep the song, but pair it with doctrine that can survive cross-examination when the last note dies. Keep the bells, but assign them to calendars that outlive charisma. Keep the robes, but publish the budgets that wash them. Keep the flowers, but say the names of the hands that watered them. What you must bury is the aesthetic alibi, the performance of simplicity that hides extraction and calls the hiding holy. What you must bury alongside it is the scientistic sneer, the performance of skepticism that mistakes not yet measured for unreal and sells the smallness as wisdom. Between those graves, a practice can live that is unashamed of smoke and unafraid of scales. You are a mammal with poems. You will always need both. Incense to quiet the part that startles at shadows, bowing to puncture the part that would conquer a room to avoid being ordinary, chanting to remind the lung it belongs to a larger breath. bells to cut time into pieces you can carry, ledgers to prove that love didn't eat the poor while singing about compassion. If your spirituality cannot say these sentences without choking on its brand, it isn't spirituality, it's decor. Keep the rituals, not because ancestors did, because bodies do, because rooms that refuse them become meetings, and meetings aren't how souls survive, because the next grief will take your words away and leave you with breath, posture, sound, and a crowd. If that crowd already knows what to do, you will call it sacred. If it doesn't, you will call it tragedy. Ritual is how communities decide which name they want on the night the power fails.